Hello and welcome to the Atheist Hour. My name is Michael. Hopefully, we won't be plagued by the technical issues we had this morning. I'm going to try to address what I was going to this morning. I do want to go over some neat science stories I read this morning while we had the break. And so to start with, the first story I read was one on a recent finding of bone tools used by Neanderthals. Now, what's important about this study is that we didn't think that Neanderthals had unique tools. We thought that was something that our ancestors or direct ancestors had developed, and here we are finding that Neanderthals had developed the same tools, some of which are actually still in use today, 50,000 years later. There's one tool called a smoother, which is used in leatherworking. It makes a type of leather that's more resistant to water and tear. Now, this was found in France by a partnered team of French and Neanderthals. Yes, French and Neanderthals were working in an excavation. It was a team from France and the Netherlands found the tools. Radiocarbon dating placed them back 50,000 years, which is about 10,000 years before Neanderthals actually died out, and well before the European or the western parts of Europe were supposed to be settled by our ancestors. And one of the things to remember is that there's been an issue for a long time of not understanding Neanderthals as being fully human. That they were somehow that they were different from us, and they were different genetically, but there's more and more evidence coming out that they had many of the same characteristics in terms of behavior that we did. And they would have, especially towards the later periods of in their evolution, they very much resembled us in terms of our physical appearance. The earlier Neanderthals were a bit more bulky. They matched the descriptions we used to see more of cavemen. But as we've recently discovered, the later generations were built more along our lines of being more gracile. In fact, if you've seen some of the programming on the BBC lately, they've shown that many of these Neanderthals were just would not look any different from us if they were still alive today and walking on the street. One of the things we've also discovered examining our DNA is that in our DNA, almost 4% of our DNA, and depending on where you're from, possibly a little more, possibly a little less, has Neanderthal DNA in your genome. So at some point, our ancestors and Neanderthals were living at the same time and did what people tend to do when they live in close proximity to each other. That's pretty cool. That's a very direct link in our genetic history there. And what we found too is we found other humans, other Homo sapiens, that at various points split off from our genome, returned to our genome throughout history. And so that's still there in our genetic heritage. One of the other stories I was reading, this ties into a little bit of a controversial subject. Scientists have been able to use stem cells to deliver medicine to targeted parts of the body. In this instance, it was a rat study. The issue with rat studies or mouse studies is they're not always directly transferable to humans. In fact, I remember reading that most mouse studies do fail, unfortunately, when they're taken to human subjects. But in this case, it was more a study of using it to target specific part or specific issues in the body. In this case, they were using the stem cells to treat inflammation in the mouse. That's just not something I would have imagined ever being possible. They're using these stem cells to directly target and treat parts of the body. Now that's going to be something that coming in years from now, as this technology is developed, could revolutionize many parts of the way we treat symptoms of disease. Now, both of these stories are going to be shared on my Facebook, so if you are on Facebook or if you have an email account, go to Facebook, add me as a friend, Michael Scott Fulford, or send me an email. That's michaelscottfulford@gmail.com. And what's interesting too, now this is much farther apart in time. They also discovered that inhabitation of the French Alps now extends back to 8,000 years. So that's around 3,000 years before the pyramids were built in Egypt. That's, I believe, roughly around the same time that that Stonehenge was under construction. I could be wrong. I'm not sure. Western European archaeology is not my strong point. But they're really starting to push back human inhibition. Yes, human inhibition is being pushed back. Beware, children. Now, the inhabitation of humans in Western Europe has been pushed back quite a bit with this finding. Now, let's see. In other news, of course, you've probably been following the shutdown, the governmental shutdown that's currently ongoing. Unfortunately, that shut down a lot of projects that receive federal funding, including NASA. I was going to talk about some of the really neat studies that have come out of NASA in the last week. Unfortunately, due to the sites being down, I was unable to pull any of them. The sites are completely down. In fact, we're not even getting information from the rovers, and I'm kind of worried due to the conditions of Mars being a very sandy planet. If you've ever parked your truck or parked your vehicle on the side of the road at the beach and left it there, you probably know what can happen if there's enough wind and rain or enough wind at least, and you try to drive off after an hour or two. So hopefully when NASA's funding does resume, they'll be able to move the rover without any problems. So this is the Atheist Hour, so I do want to start talking a little bit towards religion. Now, this morning, I kind of got off, so I'm going to resume what I was talking about this morning about what misconceptions atheists have about theists. Now, last week I talked a little bit about the misconceptions theists have about atheists. So just to balance this out a little bit, one of the ones I mentioned this morning is that there's a popular idea that if you're religious, you're stupid. Now, excuse me. Now, the reason why this keeps cropping up, there are a number of studies that show that atheists tend to have a higher IQ than theists. Now, I mentioned this morning that from my very uneducated opinion, this might have more to do with a sampling issue. Excuse me. And then actually any real indication of big difference in IQ. Keep in mind that atheists represent a very small part of the population, whereas theists are, well, really in the U.S., they are the default position. And just speaking on my own experience here, which is anecdotal, so take it for what it's worth, I found that theists and atheists are generally just as intelligent as any other group of individuals. I've encountered specific atheists who are extremely intelligent, and I've encountered specific atheists or specific theists who are very intelligent. So I don't really see that there's much of a real difference between the two. It's just a matter that one has more representatives than the other, and so you have this wider spectrum of individuals as a representation of intelligence. And I do see that a lot of atheists like to present this as, atheists are naturally more intelligent than theists. And I just disagree with this. And even if it was true, it speaks nothing as to if you yourself are more intelligent than the average theist. You can be an idiot, and you can meet a theist who's an absolutely intelligent, rational. So really don't. I disagree with this idea. Thank you. Now, one of the other ones that was brought up to me is that there is a tendency to accuse people who are liberal in their theism of being cherry pickers versus the more fundamentalists who they say are actually hold to the rules of their religion. The problem with that is that, well, fundamentalists tend to pick and choose as much as the regular Christian does. This is, really obvious if you look at some of these people who will protest the at LGBTQ events. Many of them will hold the signs or whatever, and these signs depicting Leviticus. Of course, the issue with this is they also tend to eat shellfish, especially here in Florida. They tend to wear mixed fibers. Many of them have tattoos. They don't really follow the Testament themselves, and really it's an indicative that people tend to find in the religious text the morality that they already believe. Let's see. Now, another misconception that many atheists will have about theists, well, not exactly a misconception, but many people will tend to generalize the entire group under the banner of the religion. One thing I found is that many people will identify with a religion, even if they don't actually hold to the tenets of the religion. Again, going back to homosexuality, one of the biggest examples, in my opinion, is that the Catholic Church officially is against homosexuality. Well, they're not against homosexuality. They're pro-homosexual as long as they don't act like homosexuals. Right. But if you look at grouping here in the U.S., you'll find that most people who identify as Catholic are actually pro-equal rights for same-sex individuals. Many people care about issues sensitive to the LGBTQ community. And there's a marked difference between what the tenets of the church is now teaching versus what the believers here in the U.S. hold to. Not across the board. There are many people who will still hold to many of the Catholic tenets, but they are able to spread that out. You also find that there is a forbiddance against divinity in the sense of divining fortune and such from people like, say, Nostradamus. But I found that many people who are Catholic also like these ideas. They read these books even though the Catholic Church has officially banned them. So there's a wide diversity amongst believers, and even more so when you look at other religions, people do have a tendency of just grouping all of theism under Christianity or all of theism under one type of religion. And there's a problem with that from the atheist perspective, in the sense that if you are in an argument with or in a debate or discussion with someone who does believe, you need to be able to understand their views, listen to their views, understand where they're coming from if you want to have a meaningful dialogue. You cannot use the same arguments for one type of Christian as another. You especially can't use arguments you use against Christianity that you would use against, say, Buddhism or Sikhism or Hinduism. So you do need to be aware of these differences and how and what these people actually believe versus what you want them to believe. And speaking of, we do have a tendency to stereotype people, obviously. One of the things that I've found is that many atheists will just squash down anything about atheists that they don't see as part of their viewpoint. So the idea that, let me backtrack a little bit. What I'm really trying to say is the idea that atheists will not really accept a theist who does not hold the biased views that they want them to, and will just say that they're cherry picking. Now, to me, that is a fair criticism. Now, if you're saying you're of this religion but you don't hold to the central tenets of that belief, then obviously you realize that something's wrong with it. But if you are someone who is running into it, if an atheist is having this discussion with a theist, if they are not going to hold to these beliefs, if they're the ones that are caught that you find the most problematic, that's fine. let them move on from there. If they want to have the discussion about how they justify it, that's fine. But keep in mind that if they don't hold to these beliefs, you can't really hold them against them. Yeah, sure, they've picked what they believe from the book, but uh, acknowledge too that most atheists, we pick and choose our morality. John Shook would call it pragmatism. We do the same thing. Now, if you can get the theist to admit that, maybe that's fine, but do keep that in mind. That really you're both working not so much from the same perspective, but you're working in the same idea, the same mindset, just coming at it from different ways. One thing I've noticed too is that people have a problem, people criticize Islam in a way that they mainly will criticize the most fundamentalist aspects of Islam, which they should, in my opinion. Certainly fundamentalist Islam is very harmful to people, especially women, but they will take these criticisms of the most fundamentalist sects of Islam and apply it to the entire religion. Now, the issue with this is that when it comes to that, and then the response is that, well, they're being racist, and they're saying that you cannot racially profile a religion, that does kind of run into a problem in that people who look of Arab descent are racially profiled as being Muslim, and that's where some people have a problem with it. Now, me personally, I have been, unfortunately, I would almost say, deluged with the news coming out of the Middle East in terms of how, in terms of the treatment of people who are under Islamic rule, or under a government that operates under Muslim, fundamentalist Muslim beliefs. There are people like myself who are atheists and have publicly announced their atheism and are at risk for their lives for something we take advantage of here in the U.S. or take for granted here in the U.S. We very much, I can say whatever I want within reason, short of direct threats, and even then it depends on how the threat is relayed, but I can say pretty much whatever I want and not really face any legal repercussions. And I do stress legally, it could still get me fired or whatever else, but legally there's really not any repercussion I wouldn't get for most of what I would say. But there are parts of the world where me saying I don't believe in God could wind up getting me killed. And in a legal sense. Now that can happen here in the U.S., there are people who are very, very fundamentalist in their religion, including Christianity. Christianity is not fully excluded from this, but there are people who are very fundamentalist in their beliefs, and they can cause harm to other people, but they do not have the governmental backing that is present in many of these Middle Eastern and some Asian countries. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, I don't want to show this example as atheists are being persecuted too. This is something that we face in the U.S. where theists will say, well, look, over in this country, Christians are being persecuted, so we're being persecuted. Okay, well, that's not happening in the U.S. In fact, it would be the case that the religions and lack of religions, in the case of atheism, face more persecution than Christians do, flat out. However, the Coptic Christians in Egypt are currently undergoing many, what happens to other religions under fundamentalist Muslim authority, really. Many are being killed, the churches are being attacked. That is a genuine case of religious persecution that's ongoing right now. And that is a real example of persecution, not what's happening in the U.S., where we are simply asking that people respect the First Amendment to the Constitution. And We also have problems still in states where we're seeing that the no religious test for office is not being respected. Still in 7 states, they have laws that are on the books that violate this law. But that is an example of persecution. What's going on in Egypt is an example of persecution. Being asked to respect the First Amendment in the U.S., which is the law of the land, which does not actually persecute, just removes from the state level support of religion. Removing that does not persecute religion. Moving you back to the common ground amongst all beliefs is not persecution. That just equals laying field. Okay. So that was what I wanted to speak with this morning. One of the other things is that atheists have been welcomed into the interfaith dialogue that Obama's trying to put forth, and that's great. There are people who are saying, well, atheism isn't a faith, so we really shouldn't be at the table. Now, that might surprise you to hear this, but the people saying that are atheists. Now, you might be wondering why that is, and that's really what it is. They're saying, well, we're not a faith, so we shouldn't be involved. Now, me personally, hey, I can see what they're saying, but we really need to be part of the dialogue. We are trying to be part of the dialogue. So when we have been given the opportunity to be part of the dialogue, hey, I have a crazy idea. Let's be part of the dialogue. Now, it seems to be mostly going through fine. This was an offer from President Obama to the Secular Student Alliance. This is these are clubs for schools of students who are themselves secularists. That's not necessarily atheists, but people who support the idea of keeping the U.S. secular. And that was made actually late last month, I believe. And that's one that's going to be followed up on. Now, I'm looking forward to this. This has not happened before. We'll be able to actually engage in these dialogues that are held, and hopefully good will come of it. Now, people like Tom Flynn, who works with CFI, one who spoke out against it, I'm not sure, even having read it, I'm not really sure where he's coming from with this idea. We do, certainly part of the goal to me would be working with religious groups, making sure there's a place for people who don't believe. And I understand the idea that we don't want to make it harder for people who try to make the point that atheism itself is not a religion. But we do need to be part of this dialogue. We do need to get engaged. We do need to get engaged both at a local level in terms of being open and present, and just having it known that we're part of the community as much as anyone else is, but also at the governmental level, beyond just being reactionary in terms of pursuing lawsuits when we see the separation of church and state being infringed upon. Now, this is not, again, this isn't exactly a misrepresentation, but something that we do see. People have complained to me personally about how we use people like, what's the fellow's name? I can't remember it all of a sudden. The people who are on the, television pundits who are Christian, and use these as an example against Christians, like Pat Roberts. Don't know why I forgot his name. But others like Pat Roberts and others who represent a very, very skewed version of Christianity, as most would say, who don't represent mainstream Christian belief, who don't represent mainstream Christian ideals. And that is, you can't really use those people against most Christians, in my opinion. They do represent a minority. They don't really hold to the values they say, of course, but not many do after all. There is a documentary that's claiming that Pat Robertson has been using the funds given to his church to help care for the poor, and instead use this money to help support his own diamond mines. As you know, all Christians are allowed to have at least one diamond mine, but and hey, it does support the economy in the local area. These are poor people getting a job, being able to. No, I'm joking. This was the funds were being diverted from people who thought they were donating towards a worthy cause, and instead were used to support this diamond mine that Pat Robertson supposedly owns. Now, the documentary is on the web. You can look it up, look for the evidence yourself, and make your own decision. Obviously, this does not reflect well on Pat Robertson. But can people like him or Ted Haggard or others be used against Christianity? Well, we see a similar thing with libertarianism and Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand was somebody who came up with objectivism, practiced a extreme form of libertarianism. The idea that because of what that she herself did not live up to all the values of objectivism or of libertarianism, does that necessarily reflect badly on the ideologies, or does it necessarily prove that they did not work? They don't. They just show that somebody was not able to hold to these ideologies. Someone can have a very good idea, roll it out, and not be able to practice it themselves, even if it doesn't reflect, or not being able to perform the action or perform the ideology fully themselves, does not necessarily say the idea is bad. So can you say the same thing with Christians? If you have, say, a Pat Robertson or a Ted Haggard or a Kent Hovind or others, do they show that, okay, well, you have these people who are whatever they may be? I'm not going to say for sure whether they're frauds or not. I'm sure everybody has their opinion based on the evidence that we have about them. But do they represent Christianity? Now, obviously people like Kent Hovind and these other ones, they represent a extreme view of evangelical Christianity, which is not the majority. I would not say that you can use them as a general criticism against the religion. What I would say is you can use them as a criticism against non-critical thinking, because it should be that if you examine things like evolution, you should be able to realize that Kent Hovind's theory on how life originated Kent Hovind's idea on how life on Earth originated is faulty. You should be able to come to a conclusion about the idea of the prosperity gospel that people like Pat Robertson and others preach has some severe problems with it in terms of how the idea being that the more you give to the church, the more you'll receive, and realize that that's probably not what actually happens. Now, on the other hand, I mentioned before, an episode or two back, you have people like the Pope. Now, as I mentioned in this one, that Catholics in the U.S. don't necessarily follow what the Pope says. Can he be used as a representative for Catholicism? In the sense that he is supposed to be the head of the church, I would say he is. So using what he does and says, or whichever Pope, to me that is perfectly justifiable in saying, here's what the Pope said in regards to this subject. How do you as a Catholic deal with this? Or whomever, say you have a representative of the Baptist Church, or you have a representative of a major sect of Islam. If you have a large representative, or if you have a group represented by a single individual, if that individual is saying something, you certainly hold that as an example, but only to the groups that actually follow them. So you do have to be careful when you make these. You can't really generalize out and say that Pat Robertson, you are of the opinion that Pat Robertson is a fraud, and then say therefore all of Christianity is a fraud. You can't generalize like that. But say the Catholic Pope makes a statement about we bashed that enough. Is there anything the Catholic Church hasn't said wrong lately? Okay. Let's say the Catholic Pope decides, makes a statement on why women cannot be priests, and inside that letter he says some very demeaning things to women. We can certainly use that as an example of, hey, you're a woman who's a Catholic. How do you hold to these beliefs? Or how do you feel represented by the Pope? Does what the Pope say affects your beliefs? That is something you could do. No. And certainly there has been a recent excommunication of a priest who was supportive of women being ordained as priests, and who was supportive of the LGBTQ community. Again, that to me puts a lie to the idea that this current Pope is more progressive than the last. It really seems he's just better at PR. Okay, so in the last year, when it comes to the things I've been doing with atheism and trying to educate myself, one of the things I've found is that my thing has always been, the reason why I came to atheism has been critical thinking, trying to get criticism or receive criticism or offer criticism of ideas that I did not find to be solid enough. And I have been trying over the last couple of years to become better rounded in my understanding of religion. Certainly it's more focused on Christianity than it probably should be. Christianity is more my local here. I grew up with it. I'm more familiar with its concepts and with its apologetics. And one thing I have found is that going back into it, the difficulty it is to get response to criticism or to questions. I've had issues where I will directly question somebody, and my direct question is weaved around. I will get slogans. I will get non-answers in reply. One of the things I found out, be accused of misrepresenting the position, which I may well be doing. Now, maybe I don't understand, maybe I misread, but the refusal to explain how and where I misrepresented their position. It is not enough to merely say that someone has. You must explain why someone has misrepresented their position. If this was called straw manning, is what I've been accused of. And again, I might well have done this. I can certainly recognize that maybe I've misread. Something was not clear enough that when I read it, I made a mistake. And it is possible too, and you should consider this if you're a theist who has these kind of discussions, that maybe the way you explained it was not clear enough either. And if someone asks you to better explain it, instead of just saying that your view has been strawmanned, you need to try to better explain your own position. There's the idea of a straw man is what's called a logical fallacy. It's an idea that does not necessarily, it's not a good logic representative. And that doesn't make the statement wrong if someone uses a logical fallacy in and of itself. But if someone is accused of having committed a logical fallacy, the person making the accusation has to explain how this logical fallacy was used. Now, I am someone who enjoys having discussions and having debates. I can be extremely pedantic at times. I will go into a argument and will run down and try to have the last word. To recognize that about myself. But I do try to be friendly and respectful. I've noticed that among religious people especially, but anybody with a strong ideology, that if you try to critique anything they hold personal, they take it very personally, obviously. Now, something like this would be, say, someone has a strong stance of libertarianism. Well, and maybe they don't necessarily have all the information needed to back it up. If you critique their libertarian stance, and they will become defensive, obviously. Now, myself, I am someone who has or tries to hold not only an open mind, but a willingness to be criticized. There are many things I don't know. Unlike many of the guests and many of the people who host programs on this network, I myself, I've not had the college education that many have taken or have had available to them. I am always trying to teach myself new things. So any chance I'm given the opportunity or any time I have the ability to learn, for me it has to come through criticism or through being informed of new things. And that's really why I get involved in these things. So if I'm accused of being, or if someone has made the statement that I followed through, that I've made a logical fallacy, then that's fine if I have, but I do try to learn and find out how. I would like to be informed how I did so, or what the mistake was. But it does require people on both sides being willing to answer questions, and that's something I'm finding is more difficult than I would have thought. It's more difficult to get a straight answer from some people in terms of what they believe. Do you believe this? Well, when you say, do I believe this, let me go into a little bit about what I think on something else that's entirely unrelated, and then I'll come back to it, but I won't address it. I'll just kind of mention something about it, and that's something I've seen many times. Now, that's fine. If you're not sure of it yourself, just say so. That goes for anybody, whether you're a theist or an atheist. If there's something you don't know or you're unsure of, make sure you say that. Make sure you say, I am unsure of this point, or I'm not informed on this point. And that really should be fine. Not only for the person saying it, but the person getting that back should understand as well that is a fine position to take. Someone saying they're not well enough informed to make a decision, or not well educated enough, or not having given it enough thought. Let me get back to you. That it's not going to work if you're trying to do a winning by statement, by soundbite. But if you're actually seeking honest communication, you should be willing, especially now that we have internet and you can be communicating through cell phones, through the internet itself in terms of Facebook or web forums or Twitter or whatever else, then you should be fine with letting the conversation develop as a way, take as much time as needed, and just not trying to do it by sound bites, but actual education. Something that was interesting too that I read earlier, and again, I'll share this through my Facebook page. This doesn't tie to what I was saying before. There was a study done recently. It appears in the AAS, which is a scientific journal. It's available online as well as in print. What they did was they published a paper in many different journals online. They're open source journals. You pay to have your paper published inside of it. And what they found is they purposely made mistakes in the paper they were submitting. And instead of what's supposed to happen, which is people examining the study, finding the mistakes, responding to the person submitting the story, they were printed pretty much without question, or they were published on the online portion of the site without question. Now, from reading it, there's a couple of things that I have. One, finding that they have anybody who actually referenced or citing them is one of the big indications whether a study is good or not. Even if it is published, if the study is never referenced again, it's probably not a very good study, or it's not relevant at least. And in this case, it was supposed to be a cancer drug, so if no one else referenced this paper, then that's an indication the study is not good. The other one was that they did not do a control where they tried publishing this study in a respectable journal, like Science or Nature or AAS, which this publication was talking about. And the reason why I'm concerned about that, the Wakefield study, the one that kicked off the most recent vaccination scare or panic that has been going on now for years, and still the effects are raging all over the internet, was originally published in the British medical journal, The Lancet, which is a very well-respected journal. There are many issues with the paper, including there were conflicts of interest, there were issues with the way the study was conducted, a number of other issues beside that, and The Lancet eventually retracted the paper, but it was still printed in a respectable news journal or science journal. And we do know that there's at least a decent percentage of papers that are published that are not very well referenced or not very well critiqued when they go out for publishing. So there really is to me, that would be a better way of conducting the study, would be to have this control showing that here's these known respected journals, how did they handle the paper versus these 300 online open source journals. This also goes into a problem I've had, which is the idea of paywall in science. In fact, there was a study about how the effect of paywalls on science education, on the public understanding of science, and unfortunately I was unable to read the study because it itself was behind a paywall. The abstract of the study said that paywalls do contribute to a decline in science education, and while that's fine, the actual study itself was behind a paywall, and I just find it terribly ironic. There are many issues where having access to the information is better, or makes for a better science education. After all, a lot of times people will publish studies using or release science by press release. The press release may not itself be a problem, but you do need to keep in mind that with the press release is usually put together by the people who did the study and might be a little biased towards how the study is being presented, especially since they are going to try to get grants and other things. They may overhype how the study turned out. There was a fairly recent study from NASA where one of their biologists claimed to have studied a organism that lived off of that instead of being carbon-based was sulfur-based, and then further examination showed that that was not the case. That actually it was the author of the study trying to promote it in a dishonest way. But that was only because we only were able to discover that because of open access to the information. It did not seem to be the fault of NASA, just the fault of the person working on the study, but that is an example of how we need to have better and more open information when it comes to things like science. Obviously, we need really transparency in all things is something that's becoming more important. Transparency in government, transparency in religion, transparency in probably not transparency in clothes. I can see that being a problem with people, especially with senators. But we do need more transparency in areas of politics and science and in education, various ways that we, when we are trying to develop a better idea of our place in the world and how we can affect the world, we need the ability to have things transparent. Will definitely make it so that we can understand the things we are facing. In fact, the study I mentioned earlier on stem cells, having the ability to pull the study itself and see some of the results from that study gave me a better idea of how relevant the information was and how accurate it was. If I didn't have that information, then really it's a neat study, but I would not be able to gauge the results of it. Now, let's see, we're coming down on the tail end of the show. So I do want to remind people that if you want to get in touch with me, you can find me on Facebook under Michael Scott Fulford. You can find me you can contact me through my email, which is michaelscottfulford@gmail.com. I have the Google Mail. Don't currently have a Twitter, but if it becomes popular enough, we'll set up a Twitter so you can tweet. But I've never been much of a twit myself, so. And that's really all the time we have for today. So I do hope to start hearing from people. Any recommendations, any ideas of what to do on the show, what you'd like to hear more of? Would you like to hear more science stories? Because I would love telling more science stories. Or if you would prefer to hear me to go more into religious criticism, because I would rather not, I'll admit, because that is so common. But I will definitely respond to any recommendations I get. But that's all I have for today. So thank you very much. Have a great day.